Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So, the United States launched an airstrike in Syria. They targeted the airfields where they say Syria launched these chemical attacks that killed over 80 people. That's what they tell us. And I just want to state my position on this issue. Back when Obama was the president and when he talked about seeking approval for military action in Syria, I opposed it then and I oppose it now. And I just have to say this. They say that Assad is responsible for those chemical attacks, but we don't have any way to verify that right now. For all we know, those quote unquote rebels could be responsible for that chemical attack. For all we know, ISIS could be responsible for that chemical attack. For all we know, some other party may be responsible for that chemical attack. For all we know, there may not have even been a chemical attack. For all we know. Because we have to understand the role of misinformation during wartime. We have to understand the role of propaganda during wartime. All we have to do is look back to the years of the first Iraq War. And when Saddam Hussein's regime invaded Kuwait. And when we look at the propaganda that was put out before the world in order to justify a U.S. invasion of Iraq, we have to understand that history. You had people fabricate lies about Iraq. You had people say that babies were killed in hospitals, removed from incubators and forced to die on the floors of hospitals. Those were the lies that were perpetuated and projected so that people would have some kind of anger or some kind of rage towards Iraq in order to help justify a war in Iraq, in order to build public sentiment in favor of a war in Iraq. We have to understand that history. And in the description box, I will link a story that was put out in Canadian news years ago about this whole propaganda campaign that took place in the first Gulf War. So I encourage you all to check that out for more information. And then when we look at the war in Iraq under George Bush, the son, when we look at the propaganda that was put out there about weapons of mass destruction, you had U.S. officials talking about how the warning will come in the form of a mushroom cloud, drumming up all this fear, all this angst, and all this animosity with false tales of weapons of mass destruction. So the public bought that lie. They actually believed that not only did Iraq have weapons of mass destruction, they actually believed that Iraq had something to do with 9/11, although there was zero proof actually presented of this. And we have to remember how Colin Powell went before the UN with all these charts and all this quote-unquote evidence of weapons of mass destruction in order to make that case for the war in Iraq. And people bought the lie. People believed the lie. And the U.S. invaded Iraq. They bombed Iraq. They killed civilians. And many U.S. soldiers lost their lives, all based on a lie. And after the fact, they discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction. After all that death and destruction, after destabilizing that country and the region, they realized that there were no weapons of mass destruction. This looks like it may possibly just be a false flag operation or some kind of tool in order to turn public sentiment in favor of another war. That's what it looks like. Because we don't know who was responsible for that attack, if it was, in fact, an attack. We don't know. I mean, perhaps one of those rebel groups did it in order to turn the tide in their favor, in order to encourage the United States to get involved. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is this. There are no heroes in that war. There are no heroes. You have a dictator Assad, who is oppressing his own people. You have these fanatics, ISIS, who are religious extremists, people that want to bring the society back to the Middle Ages, people that have a ridiculous and tyrannical interpretation of Islam. You have them on one end, and then you have all these other rebel groups, and nobody knows who the heroes are. There's war and destruction and evil on all sides. There is no hero here. And if the United States get involved in another conflict, if they get involved in this war, then it'll just be another quagmire, just like Afghanistan. Here we are all those years after 9/11, and you still have troops in Afghanistan. It's endless war, a cycle of violence, a cycle of retaliation, an endless quote-unquote war against terrorism. That's all this will do for the American people if we get involved in this. And also, I'm concerned that this may expand into an even larger conflict. You have Russians over there aiding the Assad regime. If somehow the United States strikes the Russians in some kind of conflict with Syria, the war can be a much bigger problem than it is right now, drawing in world powers into a conflict that we don't even need to be involved in. This is an Arab problem. This is a problem in a Muslim country. And I think that the Arabs and the Muslims need to address the problems in Syria, not the United States. Not the United States. With further destabilization of that region, if Assad is even removed from power, who's going to fill that vacuum? What we're going to see is ISIS being more empowered, emboldened, and the world is going to be less safe. It's just going to be a less safe world for everybody. It was the first the Iraq war that made it possible for an ISIS to even thrive or to even exist. Now, if you destabilize and completely overthrow Assad, who knows what else will happen? Who knows how powerful ISIS will become? It's going to be a lawless situation. And, really, I think that this whole thing, the timing is unusual. I mean, here you have Donald Trump being under a lot of pressure because of this scandal involving ties between his administration and his campaign and the Russians. That was the news focus before this airstrike. Now, all of a sudden, all the attention is not going to be focused on that scandal. It's not going to be focused on that very real issue of Russians being involved in the American elections and Russians colluding with the Trump campaign. All of a sudden, that's going to be off the table for discussion, and everybody's going to be talking about these airstrikes. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. That's something that needs to be talked about and needs to be thought about. And, I just have a few more thoughts to share about this whole thing. The other thing that I want to say is this. Everybody's so outraged about this chemical attack, and it is sickening. It's disgusting, assuming that it's an actual attack, assuming that it was an actual chemical attack. That is despicable. No human being should be treated that way. But the fact of the matter is, people are being killed in all kinds of ways in that country. In Syria, they are dropping bombs on homes and buildings with people in it, apartment buildings, killing women, men, and children. People are dying. Why is it that people are more outraged about the deaths of people at the hands of chemical weapons than at the hands of bombs and bullets and all that kind of stuff? Dead is dead. You have all these people, thousands upon thousands of people dead, and people are more concerned about the 80 or so people that died from a chemical attack, then all the thousands upon thousands of people that have been bombed and shot and just destroyed. To me, that just doesn't make sense. You know, death is death. All death and destruction needs to be condemned. And I have to focus on this last issue, and that's the issue of terrorism. Trump talked about how he condemns all forms of terrorism. Well, he needs to condemn the actions of his military when they dropped that bomb on those people in Mosul, killing over 200 civilians. And that's not the first time, and it won't be the last time that the United States kills innocent civilians. If you are concerned about terrorism, you have to condemn the terrorism of Israel. You have to condemn it if you're going to be about condemning all forms of terrorism. Yes, all forms of terrorism must be condemned. I agree with that. So why don't you live up to that and scrutinize the actions of your own military or even your own self and your own allies?